start for this conversation, Gladys, Miriam, Mohamed, Sakina, Daniel, and Tosin. Thank you. I would like to thank them for kicking off this new series that highlights the youth engagement at the Atlantic Council, the African Youth Speaks. From Togo to Burkina Faso, from Nigeria to Sudan, and even Paris, their testimonies will guide us during this conversation. So I'm delighted to be joined by you both. You are young too and pioneers. Representative Sarah Jacobs, you are the youngest member of the Democratic House leadership. You sit on the House Foreign Affairs, where you have been recently elected ranking member for the Subcommittee on Africa. You also sit on the House Armed Services Committee and belong to many caucus, for example, women. Representative Jacobs, you represent the 51st District of California. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Representative Ilhan Omar, you are the firstborn on the continent to become a member of Congress, of the US Congress, the first Black woman to represent Minnesota, and one of the first 2 Muslim American women elected to Congress. You are a member of the House Budget Committee. You serve on the House Education and Workforce Committee. You are also the chairwoman of the US-Africa Policy Working Group you launched earlier this year. You will tell us more about it. Thank you for joining us too.
Great to be here with you, Ambassador.
With that, Representative Jacobs, I would like to start with you. A very quick question. Often overlooked, the US Congress has an important role in foreign policy. What does the Congress bring in the US-Africa policy alongside the executive branch?
Yeah, well, thank you. And I think Congress does have an important role to play in foreign policy, both in making sure that more voices are heard when policies are being made. Congress actually has the constitutional right to declare war and peace. And so when we're looking at all of US military engagements around the world, I think it's really important that Congress is involved in doing that oversight and understanding where we have troops abroad, why, what's the mission. I think we need to do a little bit more of that oversight, truthfully. Congress also has a really important role to play in security assistance and improving security assistance and making sure that we are doing it in a way that aligns with our values, which is something I spend a lot of time focused on. And at the end of the day, Congress is who funds the executive branch, and so we have a responsibility and frankly bear a burden when we, for instance, fund the Defense Department at so much higher levels than the State Department and USAID, and that really comes from Congress.
Ilhan Omar, what do you expect to add in the DC Africa conversations with the Africa Policy Working Group you just created? With Sarah Jacobs, I think,
Yes.
with member too.
I'm a member, yes.
Yeah.
And we just actually had our first briefing today.
Okay.
So there's been,
On Sudan.
Sarah and I are tag teaming on Africa Day
Yes.
today.
Wonderful.
I think the reason and the mission and the focus of the working group really is around what the theme is today for Africa Day, which is Our Africa, Our Future. Our work in this working group is to try to figure out how do we become better, authentic partners with the continent. How do we create a lasting relationship that is both mutually beneficial and one that creates a better trust and furthers our ability to cultivate that relationship. We know that Africa and its countries are not able to respond to the United States when it comes to addressing extremism, addressing the needs for investment, addressing the creation of jobs, addressing empowerment of young girls and women, as one of the speakers talked about. If we do not have established the relationship that is based on trust. And so what we are trying to do with this working group is to try to invite people who oftentimes do not get an audience with members of Congress to engage civil society, to engage people who are drafting policy on the continent, to engage the diplomatic corps, to invite the State Department, to engage members of Congress that do not have a portfolio that includes
20 members in this
Yes.
of Congress in this group. Right?
and today, even at our first briefing, we had members that are not part of the working group come
Good job.
to hear about what's happening in Sudan. And so that's sort of the idea, to remove the limitations that a committee has and to create a better space for us to engage with the continent.
We'll come to that topic specifically with you, Sudan, later in this conversation. Allow me to come back to your colleague. Both of you attended the Atlantic Council Africa dinner a few months ago that kicked off the U.S.-Africa Leaders Summit in Washington, which set the stage for stronger U.S. commitment to the continent. And since then, numerous members of the U.S. cabinet, including the Vice President Harris and the Treasury Secretary Yellen, visited 18 countries, 18 African countries in 3 months. It's a lot. What's going on? Do you think that this summit has been a turning point, Sarah Jacobs, or work in progress? Do you expect more?
Well, look, I think that what we've seen both with the summit and with the visits and the announcements that have followed is that the Biden administration really recognizes the importance of re-engaging with the African continent that we know, especially over the 4 years prior and the previous administration, didn't get the kind of attention that it deserved from the American government. And so I think this is really about understanding that Africa is the fastest growing continent. It has the youngest population. It's the fastest growing economies. That there is a real importance in making sure that we are partnering with Africa, partnering with Africans on our shared values, on our shared interests. And I think we're going to continue seeing more of that from the Biden administration.
And precisely, Representative Omar, the context is important. And this happened at the very moment of this war in Ukraine, with a new geopolitical order or disorder, I don't know yet. South African President Cyril Ramaphosa announced a few days ago a delegation of African presidents, including Egypt, Republic of Congo, Zambia, Senegal, and Uganda, would meet with President Putin from Russia and Zelensky from Ukraine to present a peace plan for Africa. Have you been surprised by this initiative, and do you believe in its success?
I'm not surprised. I think it is important for us to remember when the United States was debating support for Ukraine in the Russia-Ukraine war. At the UN or UN Security Council, that the biggest defenders of sovereignty and territorial integrity came from heads of African countries. And it is really also important to recognize that there is an argument, right, to be made when we think about how African countries see themselves as they interact with the international community, especially the United States. There is still awful remembrance of the Cold War and imperialistic mentality that many African countries are weary of. And so when we put when the conversation becomes about democracy versus autocracy, many African countries would love to have the conversation be about sovereignty and territorial integrity. And if they are to see this war as a proxy war between Russia and the United States, they are going to start to think about what is in their best interest. Is alliance with one good for them, or is non-alliance their path forward? And we are seeing many of them declaring their independence in that regard and saying, you know, we want to create policies and forward policies for ourselves that get us the best relationships possible for investment, for development, for strengthening our institutions. And so what we have to be able to do is offer that alignment through honest partnership. And that is the best way I think we compete in this moment. We also have to realize the kind of economic impact when it comes to imports of essential goods that the African continent has suffered. Because, you know, when it comes to things like wheat, Russia and Ukraine were the biggest exporters to the continent. Today I was meeting with an ambassador, the Tunisian ambassador, and you know the level of impact that the war has had on the continent is not something that we're spending a lot of time talking about and addressing. And I think there is a role for the United States to collectively work with the continent to fill that void. And I think that is how we move forward.
Speaking of competition, we heard China and Russia, of course, and Sarah Jacobs, on the occasion of your appointment as a ranking member, you said the African continent has long been ignored, neglected, and exploited by the international community, especially by the West, largely receiving attention in only the most dire circumstances and through a paternalist approach. So we live a time of competition between global powers on the African continent, but also regional powers, including Emirates, Turkey, Israel. But for Russia and China, Africa seems to be a matter of national security through the access to the critical minerals, for example, or more politically, the 30% African votes at the UN, at the United Nations. Israel and Emirates, I just mentioned, have also engaged a race for arable lands. The US promised a lot during the US-Africa Leader Summit, but seems to want to catch up. So why the US did not understand earlier that Africa is also a matter of national security for them too?
Well, I think the previous administration had a very misguided view of what makes America strong around the world. And I think that, you know, that's something that the Biden administration is working really hard to fix and to undo a lot of the damage that was caused by the previous administration, both in Africa and around the world. And that's why I think this African Leaders Summit and this re-engagement is so important, and why we need to understand that while there is competition now, we can't only view our relationship with Africa through the lens of competition. Because I think some of the key lessons from the Cold War are that supporting authoritarian actors for our short-term alignment or influence actually has really harmful impacts. And we see in places like Chad, Angola, DRC, US efforts to counter the Soviet Union and its proxies actually caused backsliding, violence, and their populations and governments are still suspicious of the US because of those actions taken during the Cold War. And we know Africa has the youngest population, so the decisions we make now are going to have really long-term consequences. And, you know, I think we need to re-engage with Africa because it's important for us, not because it's a competition with Russia and China. And we don't need to match them one for one. We don't need to, you know, ignore our values because we want to make sure someone doesn't go work with Wagner Group, or, you know, they're going to do a deal with the Chinese. We need to work with Africans where it makes sense for us and where it makes sense for the local community, and do what's in all of our long-term best interest and not get so focused on this short-term competition.
Would you like to add something?
Yeah, I mean, I think the great powers competition lens sort of, I think, invokes again that imperialistic mentality, right? And I think for many of these African countries want to have partners that are not reminding them of sort of the horrors of the Berlin Conference, where, you know, who gets to own which African country, and dividing them up in that regard. Many of them want to, like I said earlier, they want these investments. They want you know, partners that are coming in and investing in development. And I think we can play a role in the United States to have a foreign policy that says, look, you can work with China, you can work with Russia, but when it comes to investment, you know, these are countries that don't have human rights standards, they don't have labor standards, they you know, don't have environmental standards for their projects. What we are able to offer is A, B, and C, and then also do actually invest. What we provide most of the time is sort of this disciplined, punitive engagement of you have to do these things, and even if those countries were to fulfill this list, they're not sure that the kind of investment that they would be getting from China or Russia would come in, and so we have to also be a guarantor of that investment.
Speaking of the ability or freedom African countries have to speak to the other powers, I'm sure you have not missed this drama around South Africa. In the US, the US ambassador said that South Africa secretly sold arms to Russia in last December, as part of its war in Ukraine. And South Africa is chairing the BRICS right now, this year. So how should, because South Africa is an important country for the historic reasons you know for Africans, how should the US deal with Mandela's country? Because that's the point, right?
Yeah, well, look, I think that on the whole in Africa, we're very clear. We're not trying to make people pick sides. That's not what this is about. This is about standing up for shared values like democracy, like human rights, and acknowledging that there are many players in the field and everyone has a role they can play, and that the United States wants to be a partner in this regard. I think when it comes to South Africa, I think, you know, the disturbing things are, you know, the high levels of corruption that we're seeing in the government, the not just the friendship with Russia, but the, you know, potential evasion of sanctions. You know, I think there's a difference between not having people pick sides and not asking people to, and people proactively evading sanctions and sort of going against the international shared norms that we all ascribe to.
Just to come back to our young people, Africans who spoke earlier, I would like now to dive into the different topics they talked about, and starting with women. And I know that you two are really involved in this question. And I mentioned that Sarah Jacobs is a member of the Women Caucus. And
I think Ilhan is too.
You are too?
Yes.
Oh, both of you. So that's cool. So any of you can answer this question. So, Gladys mentioned this point, and you speak up very often when it comes to women's rights. So, knowing what's going on about women's rights in America a lot these past months, they are once again struggling for their rights, right? What kind of cooperation should have women, American women and African women? How could they struggle together around this cause?
Well, I think that's a great question and a great point. And I also think it highlights why the U.S. needs to engage in these partnerships with some humility, that this really is about partnership, not the U.S. coming and wagging our finger and trying to tell people how to do things, because we're also experiencing challenges here, and we can learn from each other on the best way to engage in these. And I think there is a lot of opportunity for, you know, us as women to work together to try and push our governments, push the international community to respect our rights and to do things differently. And I think that's a real opportunity in what is otherwise a kind of difficult time when it comes to women's rights.
Yeah, I mean, what I was hearing from the young woman's question was a little bit about what can we do to try to remove barriers.
Yeah.
Because I often used to say, and I stole this from my father, who used to say, you know, it's not that women or girls need empowerments. They just need obstacles to be removed so that they can step into their power. And, you know, one of the things that we're doing in Congress and advocating for our sisters and our siblings who are challenged in some of these states that are rolling back their rights and freedoms is to try to find avenues, right, for them to be able to access their rights. And I think one of the things that I would advocate for is to do the same for our siblings in Africa, to try to advocate for policies that remove barriers, to try to advocate for policies that create opportunities for investment. We know that African women are entrepreneurs. And so how do we lift that up? How do we shine a bright light? How do we continue to encourage them to be able to access the markets in a more equitable way?
And we know that African women are really committed for their communities,
Yes.
and they are true power in African societies. And one of the
Actually,
topics,
I think to that point, it's fascinating to me because the only time that is fully realized is during times of conflict.
yeah,
Right? Like during war. I mean, when I was little and we were going through war, almost every single family was being saved by their moms and daughters and sisters. You know, they were the ones who were selling their jewelry. They were the ones who were finding avenues of like where to hide and how to navigate that system. They're the ones when they escaped into a place they felt safe, they were sending their resources and trying to find jobs. And I think that's also something that we have to continue to honor and uplift so that during peacetime, people also recognize their ability to contribute to society as well.
exactly. And there is a fight they are engaged in these days. It's the fight for climate. And here I would like to remind what Miriam and Daniel said in the discussion. We host here at the Africa Center a climate strategy with an African vision, and it has been launched a few months ago by the Vice President of Nigeria. We know, Sarah Jacobs, that Africans suffer the most from the global warming, even if they don't contribute to this global warming. African nations pay the highest price, but they don't receive any funding from the international community for that. The $100 billion pledged for annual climate financing was not met. How can the U.S. support Africans in that struggle, and how can they make this pledged met?
Yeah, just a month ago, I was in Kenya actually looking and meeting with some of the communities that are really impacted by this 6th drought season that they've had. And, you know, it was a really meaningful experience for me to see, you know, you hear about the devastation of the droughts, but really seeing it firsthand. And I think there's a lot more we need to be doing. I think, you know, part of the challenge right now is that we're in the minority. And as you are probably following along, there's a lot of discussion about U.S. spending at the moment. And some of our colleagues want to cut the foreign assistance budget by 22 to 50%. And, you know, that will mean that we cannot provide the humanitarian assistance we've been providing to places like West Africa, Southern Africa, East Africa, that we know are really in need of this humanitarian assistance. One of the things we also need to figure out how to get out of is this cycle of constant humanitarian assistance and not doing the longer term resilience work. And that's some of what I was looking at when I was out in Kenya, is how we make sure the vast amount of humanitarian money we're giving out is getting to the people who need it, but in such a way that we're, investing in local communities. So I was really glad to see, for instance, when I was in Kenya, the ready-to-use therapeutic food that they were using. Historically, it had only been able to be produced in a few countries because when UNICEF first created it, it had a patent with a French company, actually. But now they were sourcing it directly from a Kenyan company using Kenyan groundnuts. And, I think that kind of thing, making sure that the humanitarian assistance we're doing is actually feeding into longer term resilience is a really important piece of it, while we work to get the funding we know is important, but harder to get at this particular moment.
Ilanoma, I would like to.
I think that's been sort of the communication disconnect between the pledge and like actual money.
Yeah.
I think the commitment seems to be there. We fought really hard in advocating for the United States and the West. In creating a fund, right, to help mitigate some of the damages that they've been able to cause, because we know that all of these countries industrializing has created a burden for Africa and just the global South, and the need for these resources is real, and we just have to now make sure that this commitment is met. Unfortunately, obviously, in the United States, especially in Congress, we don't have a huge ability to be able to push for that. We just have to make sure we fight against these devastating cuts. But to be able to fulfill that promise is going to be challenging. And I would say to the point about us not constantly being stuck in this space of funding crises. Rushing to put out fires, but thinking about ways that we can create partnerships throughout the continent, whether it's regional, whether it is partnership with other Western countries, to say, here is a pool of money that we can pull together to create these resilient plans for these communities and then help fund it. So today I was reading about an example in Somalia. Somalia is not that dissimilar to Kenya. They experience droughts that regularly come, that bring the country on the brink of famine. But they also experience severe flooding that comes right after that. So you have displacement from the droughts, and then you have displacement because of the flooding. And so it's a country that's constantly in crisis, as well as the other instabilities that exist there. And so the United States, through USAID, the UK fund and Qatar fund came together to put in $10 million. And they're going to fund projects like digging wells and creating other sustainability for the country. And I think that's genius. And so we obviously have a space to be a convener as the United States, and we should be using that power and that leverage of convening to try to create those kind of investments.
Yes. Beyond the funding and the financial investment aspect, there's also behind this topic of climate the matter of creating jobs and value. These days we talk a lot about critical minerals in Africa, so important for electrical vehicles, for example, in the West. So how is it possible for the US, for example, to take advantage of these critical minerals for these vehicles and green transition without creating value for Africans too? Because Africans, they need create value. Not only raw materials should be taken from them, but also jobs should be created on the ground. So how can we solve this problem? Because we missed the opportunity earlier in the past to solve this problem. So now how can we draw lessons from the past and do better now? And work on a transformative economy in Africa? It's a tough question, right?
That's the ultimate wish.
Okay.
Right? Like, can we please get to a place where we learn from past mistakes?
Exactly.
And do better in the future. I think, vast majority, as you were saying, of Africa's resources are extracted as raw minerals.
Yes.
They are developed and processed, and oftentimes they are resold. As we see with oil, there's like almost no refineries in Africa. Even the countries that are oil rich don't have refineries. They have to send it, and then they buy it back at a higher cost, which makes almost no sense. And so one of the things I think that we can do, and we're hoping to do, is to change, I think, the way in which investors here in the United States think about, think about Africa, right? This is not, there is this bizarre lens and narrative that is around Africa that, one, it's one country. So first of all, we have to say, Africa is not a country, it's a continent.
55 countries.
Right? And
54.
And Sarah's laughing this because she knows. I mean, so many people come up to me, they think I'm from Sudan. So there's that sort of space that we're existing in Washington. So getting that straightened out first, and then saying, there are many countries in Africa, right? And even within the country, there are different spots where you can go and invest in. And, there is labor that is ready, as we've mentioned multiple times. It's the youngest continent.
Yes.
There are infrastructures that could be created to create manufacturing within the continent. And as we have bravely encouraged investment in places like Vietnam or Cambodia or many other countries that have challenges, we should be encouraging the same in Africa and try to sort of wash away this really dangerous narrative that the whole continent is on fire and it's not somewhere anybody should get near unless they're only trying to put out the fire.
Yeah, I think another key piece of this is why the U.S. needs to focus our engagement on helping to promote good governance and transparency, because actually a lot of what you're seeing in the critical mineral space, right, is the Chinese coming in, buying up the minerals, exporting it. We're not seeing a lot of benefit to local communities of that, but we are seeing corrupt officials getting their kickbacks for it, right? And so the more that we can work with local governments, make sure we're using all of the tools that we have to help promote good governance, and importantly, also making sure that what we're doing does not hinder good governance. I think that is also an important way to make sure that when these critical mineral deals are being done, they're being done with the people's interest in mind, not just with certain corrupt officials.
I think,
I would just end on this topic. Again, I mentioned the other countries in Asia and Central America and South America. We have gotten comfortable in doing things in two-step, right? We've encouraged for these countries to develop better, accountable institutions, while we have also encouraged investment and development.
yes.
For Africa, it just seems that we are waiting for these institutions to be strong without realizing that there is no country that is going to be able to have good governance, that is going to be able to build the kind of institutions that are necessary for that good governance. To build a very well thought out anti-corruption policy without having resources to be able to create the economic viability and vibrancy that is needed in order for people to give that government the credibility and the authority to continue to carry out, right, its policies. If you're constantly worried about whether there's going to be a coup, if you're constantly worried about, whether there's going to be a civil war, if you're constantly worried about all of these things, you think you have a very short time. So you're going to try to extract as much as you can. But if you have the resources to be able to feature people and also build the institutions, and you feel comfortable enough to do that, then I think we will start to see a better outcome for the continent.
I have the impression you want to talk about democracy and good governance. So speaking of that, I would like to make a focus on Sudan. You just mentioned, and today you attended or organized a briefing about Sudan, right? This country is important to the U.S., and there is a huge fight between two generals who made a coup together a few months ago. So Mohammed mentioned the importance of democracy, of supporting democracy on the African continent. It's important for young Africans. And I would like to have your opinion about the U.S. policy to Sudan, this policy of sanctions. Is it the best way to support democracy, or do you think that actions like launched by U.S. civilian organizations to support democracy is a better way to do it? What is your opinion about the situation in Sudan, both of you?
You go first.
Sure. I mean, the latter, obviously. We believe in respecting the will of the Sudanese people to see a civilian governance. There has been a decades-long effort by the Sudanese people to not live under military dictatorship. And, although the civilian government and the people's actualization of that was short-lived, I think it's really important for us to not look at this situation and address the crisis by only treating these generals with the legitimacy that they want, but using this as a time to legitimize civil society, because they're the ones now that are delivering the humanitarian aid. They're the ones that are in the forefront, providing for the people that are so devastated by this war. And I think one thing that we have done right is to encourage for ceasefire, to use regional partners who have influence to lead the talks, whether it's Saudi Arabia or leaders in IGAD, or South Sudan that has sort of a sibling relationship with Sudan. Also, as sibling relationships go, not always smooth. And I think that the path forward, if we are to move with sanctions, it has to be very targeted. And we heard from folks today who were very adamant about the kind of sanctions that they wanted to see, and ways in which we can do these sanctions without causing economic and personal harm to the people of Sudan.
As usual on these topics, Ilhan and I agree. I think that there's a lot of lessons to be learned from what's happened in Sudan over the past few years. I think the first is that from the get-go, the United States should have put the civilian leadership more in the driver's seat and used the moment in time that we had and used the leverage that we had in that moment to try and make sure we were getting civilian rule. And I think we have often seen in many cases that peace agreements that rely only on military leaders or are really premised on the idea that armed groups are going to share power, they don't tend to work. We know peace agreements last longer when they have civil society, when they have women, they have more representation around the table. And so we need to do a better job of making sure as Ilhan said, we're not just empowering the two generals with legitimacy, but we're actually listening and working more closely with local civilian voices and making sure that they're part of the solution.
Thank you very much. So the time is flying, so I would like to end this conversation with two maybe more focused questions on both of you. Sarah Jacobs, I remember you the first time you honored us by attending our first event on creative industries. It was during time of COVID, and I wanted to have you here one day to speak more about creative industries, certainly because you come from California, the land of Hollywood, right? And Sakina mentioned the importance of creative industries as a new market. And our dream here at the Africa Center is to connect more Hollywood and Nollywood, unless Bollywood does it. I don't know. We'll see. But we remember this last month, I think, VP Harris visited Ghana and studios. She's also from California. So we know how important the narrative is, changing the African narrative is when it comes to creative industries. The effect of Wakanda is certainly strong. And right tomorrow, Wizkid and Burna Boy will attend the Miami Afro Nation Festival. So I just wanted to ask you one question about this. What could you say and do, maybe, to encourage your constituencies to invest in African creative industries?
Yeah, look, I think I love Nollywood movies. When I lived in Ghana, I would listen to a lot of Ghanaian and Nigerian music out at the clubs.
You want to say more about it?
No, I don't.
Okay.
But
Please do.
Please, yeah, we are listening.
But I do think that there's real opportunity there, and you know, I think we've already seen some amazing collaborations, and I think we'll continue to do so. And you know, I think we should make sure that the U.S. is open to talent from all over the world, because that's what's always made America this great innovative place. And you know, I think we need to do a better job of being welcoming to creative and other talent from Africa.
Exactly. And my last question for Representative Omar, personal too, more personal. I said when I started, you are the first Congress member to be born on the African continent. It puts you in a very special position of role model for Americans and Africans too. How do you see the role of African Americans and immigrants in the U.S. policy to Africa? What do you think of the presidential diaspora group launch after the U.S. Africa Leaders Summit? We hosted for my first Africa Day at the Atlantic Council, Ambassador Linda Thomas Greenfield, and she mentioned the importance of the African Americans in the U.S. policy to Africa. How do you see this question?
I miss the ambassador when she was at the Africa desk. She used to tour the country and meet with the African diaspora community, and she also helped administer my resettlement to this country. So I know that her commitment to engaging the diaspora is a serious one. I think, you know, there shouldn't really be policy that's being created about Africa without Africans, whether they are Africans living in the continent or they are Africans in the diaspora. I think that there is a missed opportunity when you don't have us at the table and at the driver's seat. Majority of the internal policies within any given African country is oftentimes influenced by Africans in the diaspora, whether it is advocating for independence, whether it is advocating for creative ways to fight extremism, whether it is advocating for better educational opportunities, business and investment opportunities. There's a huge voice that diaspora groups have when it comes to different African countries. And just even they also serve as the economic engine. I think something like $44 billion of remittances is sort of what the African diaspora sends back to the continent. And we, I think, have to take our role and our responsibility more seriously. One, I think, education is important. If we want more people to care about Africa, we have to be talking about Africa, educating people about Africa. Yeah. But we also, I think, have an important role in shifting the narrative about Africa. Mm-hmm. And sort of crafting a new narrative. Yeah. I think this idea that we constantly have to only be asking for help, mm-hmm. And pushing for humanitarian assistance or involvement from our governments to stop a coup or a civil war, and that's the only time they hear from us, has to end. Yeah. We also have to be leaders in asking for more investments to take mm-hmm. place, more companies to go into. And one of the things that I've been doing and will continue to do is encourage my colleagues mm-hmm. To utilize their convening power to encourage mm-hmm. businesses within their congressional districts to think about investing. Yeah. In the continent, because the opportunities are endless. Yes. And I hear about it all the time. As I attend investment conferences for the continent, there's just a real honest opportunity for many of these businesses to be able to make good money mm-hmm. While the continent benefits.
Well, thank you very much. Representative Omar and Jacobs, for this very inspiring conversation. It was a worldwide tour and discussion from Pretoria to Paris, Washington to Beijing. So, which means that Africa is a strategic player and it is at the center of the world. And we are very lucky and honored to have you both for this 16th anniversary of the African Union. So thank you very much. Next June, we will have the same sitting, but maybe different conversation with Republican members of the Congress. And on that note, talk soon.
Yes.
Yes. Thank you.
Thank you.